The First Persian Gulf War was an incredibly crucial military event in the late 20th century, which not only exemplified American interventionist and neoconservative foreign policy at its finest, but was also one of the first conflicts the United States was involved in the 20th century that was not part of the ideological standoff with the communist Soviet Union known as the Cold War, as the Soviet Union had officially fallen at around the same time as the First Persian Gulf War, and therefore this conflict was the first that America participated in which it was the sole superpower in the world. Now, the First Persian Gulf War culminated in around 1990-1991 as a result of various factors, so allow me to give some brief background. Up until the early 1990s, the Sunni Ba'athist, or the moderate Arab socialist, dictatorship in Iraq, which was led by a man named Saddam Hussein, was actually strongly supported by the United States, including during the 1980s when President Ronald Reagan helped finance their war with Iran, as well as continued to support, finance, and arm them during their gassing of the Kurds, or the tolerant Shia Islam population in the country, and even when it shot down an American ship off its coast. However, the tide began to turn between US and Iraqi relations when, in 1990, Saddam Hussein and Iraq engaged in almost an erratic policy in which they decided to invade the neighboring nation of Kuwait, which was also an American ally, as a result of an oil dispute between their borders. Promptly, the United States completely withdrew its previous unilateral support for Iraq and the Hussein government and ordered the United Nations to engage in global sanctions against Iraq to incite it to withdrawal. Now, these sanctions were passed, and around August of 1990, which basically passed an oil embargo or prohibited the sale of oil, a crucial resource, to Iraq and the Hussein government. Now, despite this, Saddam Hussein refused to withdraw from Kuwait and maintained a strong military presence there. As a result, in around January of 1991, the United Nations passed a resolution which authorized the United States, as well as a coalition of forces from Great Britain, France, and several other nations, to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. And within just a matter of weeks, as a matter of fact, within about 1 week or two, they were successful in doing so, as the Iraqi army and the regime there was nowhere near as powerful as the UN coalition of some of the world's leading powers. However, after the liberation of Kuwait, the United States decided to engage in a near unilateral, or basically on its own, invasion of the Hussein government in Kuwait, in Iraq, known as Operation Desert Storm, after the liberation of the occupied territory, where the George H.W. Bush administration ordered General Norman Schwarzkopf, a notable American war hero, to lead a battalion to penetrate the nation of Iraq and to potentially overthrow the Hussein government. Now, the American forces completely squandered the Iraqi troops. It was a crippling defeat for the Iraqi government, with about 100,000 Iraqis losing their lives and only about 150 American soldiers losing theirs. However, in the end, even though the United States was able to coerce the Hussein government into capitulating in all forms in the conflict, the Bush administration decided not to overthrow the Hussein government, fearing that it would destabilize the Middle East, as because he was a moderate Sunni leader of the region, a predominantly Shia Muslim region, they feared that if he was gone, then basically there'd be a major religious war between opposing Islamic powers, such as the Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia. Now, as a result of this, the United States officially engaged in several peace talks with the Hussein government, in which he agreed to pay massive war reparations, to define his borders only within the Iraqi countryside, and to destroy all of his chemical weapons. Now, there were many controversial elements of Operation Desert Storm and the entire First Persian Gulf War itself. Not only was there a massive anti-war resistance opposing American and global intervention in a third world country but with only a marginally effective military, but there were also many elements in the conflict that were highly controversial with accords to the UN Charter and international law. Specifically, some countries within the United Nations didn't believe that the globe had done enough to exhaust all diplomatic and peaceful resolutions to the illegal Iraqi occupation of Kuwait before authorizing a military liberation. One of the biggest controversies was the fact that many accused the UN of only passing an oil embargo on Iraq, which was only marginally effective because, let's not forget, Iraq was not only a major oil supplier and so therefore could extract its own oil without global sales, but actually occupied Kuwait for the exact reason of getting oil reserves. So really, the oil embargo was not really a serious incentive to stop the Iraqi government from occupying Kuwait. Many other countries believed that other more universal sanctions on more important and key items, such as food, water, basic military and medical aid, and other crucial resources would actually motivate the Iraqi government to withdraw from Kuwait and cooperate with the international community without any use of military force. There were also three other major controversies which many did use to criticize certain aspects of the war. For instance, the aftermath of the First Persian Gulf War was perhaps the most criticized element of it, as even though the Hussein government surrendered and engaged in peace talks with the opposing belligerents in the conflict, the United States still passed unilateral sanctions against the Iraqi government, which they essentially deemed were necessary to ensure that Hussein would never do something erratic again, such as invade another bordering country or re-invade Kuwait, and to basically keep him in check. However, he had already given up many of his crucial military supplies that would allow him to do such a thing, and ultimately, the sanctions were deemed revenge sanctions by many members of the international community and hotly condemned. They were actually believed to have killed almost 1 million Iraqi civilians, and some foreign policy analysts believe that this may have actually led to the growth of Islamic radicalism and jihadism in the region in the following decade during the War on Terror and the Al-Qaeda attacks on the United States and other Western nations. Also, another controversy was the whole operation of Desert Storm itself. Operation Desert Storm as a whole was also heavily criticized by other members of the international community and within the United States because of the fact that it was not explicitly authorized by the United Nations. The United Nations resolution allowing for coalition forces to liberate Kuwait said exactly that the coalition forces could only push the Iraqi government out of Kuwait and would only be allowed to invade Iraq itself and overthrow its government if they refused to cooperate or continued to fight in an offensive fashion. Even though this didn't happen, the United States decided to continue to invade the region and to perhaps even overthrow the Hussein government, as I elucidated on earlier, as they feared that he was still an unstable ruler who would continue to wreak havoc on the region. And even though there was definitely strong arguments in favor of this, it was still a highly controversial move that was not officially supported by UN doctrine. And finally, one of the most controversial elements of the war was the fact that while this didn't have much to do with the official UN Charter authorizing the conflict, it did have much to do with popular support in the United States for the war, which was that one of the main propaganda campaigns, which was when a Kuwaiti girl testified before Congress, alleging that the Hussein government and Iraqi troops had engaged in horrifying war crimes and human rights violations of Kuwaiti civilians, including throwing Kuwaiti babies out of incubators in hospitals. This whole testimony was later found out to be a fallacy. In fact, the civilian Kuwaiti girl who testified was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, and she was actually a paid actress who had been told to lie before the US Congress. Now, besides all of this, there were many crucial arguments in favor of the war, and in the end, the war did stop the illegal occupation of Kuwait and ultimately kept Iraq and Saddam Hussein virtually in check for the rest of the decade, as there was no evidence he ever expanded his grip. There was no serious military intervention on behalf of Iraq in any other neighboring nations, and besides the crippling domestic policy of his regime, it was a relatively cooperative place with the courts of the international community. However, there was a major difference on this front in around the early 2000s when the United States authorized a second invasion of Iraq, known as the Iraq War, following the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States. But that's a whole separate video. So overall, the First Persian Gulf War was an incredibly important conflict which redefined America's role in the world and served as a symbol of American interventionist foreign policy.